It's my pleasure to introduce you to the panel on protecting people in the context of climate change and disaster. I'm Giulio Bartolini. I'm professor of international law at Roma Tre University, and I'm also editor-in-chief of the Yearbook of International Disaster Law. I'm very glad to be here to moderate a fantastic line of speakers who are going to discuss with us one of the most timely topics. We have seen previously with the presentation of the Grotius lecture by Professor Daudet. He was speaking about the climate crisis, was speaking about the health crisis, and of course it means that both crises are severely affecting the population. Just think about that COVID-19 has already caused more than 2.5 million deaths. Severe damages and losses are caused every day by climate-related extremes like wildfires or floods. And of course, disaster and climate change have multiple legal, policy, and humanitarian implications, which basically raise a series of legal and policy elements of discussion. In particular, the protection of victims of such events is one of the key issues as highlighted by recent practice in international law that we are also going to discuss. As you know, for instance, the UN General Assembly has been called to discuss the proposal made by the International Law Commission to adopt a universal treaty based on the draft articles on the protection of persons in the event of disaster. And of course, the same International Law Commission is currently discussing the topic of sea level rise, where of course a series of protection issues are also present. At the same time, yesterday in this same annual meeting, there was a fantastic panel discussing the proposal made by some states, echoing youth movement proposal in order to ask to the International Court of Justice to make an advisory opinion on the impact of climate change on with regard to human rights. And of course, we also know the recent cases in front of multiple domestic as well as universal and regional human rights bodies try to address the climate crisis through the lens of human rights in front of the Human Rights Committee, in front of the European Court of Human Rights, the Committee on the Rights of Child. And plus, of course, we are also well aware of the inclusion in the preamble of the Paris Agreement of reference to human rights elements. So all these elements of practice raise a series of questions, not only from a legal perspective, but also on the role of politicians or humanitarian actors and affected communities as scholars with regard to the climate crisis and related disaster. I'm very glad we are going to discuss this panel through a series of distinguished academics, practitioners, and politicians. And of course, I will also be glad to discuss it through the support of the virtual audience. Feel free, as you know, to use the box in order to make to our speakers a series of questions we will address during the Q&A session. And plus, of course, at the end of this session, don't forget to click on the continue conversation, and all of us will be more than glad to continue this conversation on a more informal manner. Having said that, I'm glad to start with the first speaker, and the first speaker is Kirsten Agun from the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, where Kirsten is a senior analyst at the Policy and Diplomacy Unit, but she also one of the mastermind for a fantastic publication. I would really encourage you to have a look at it, which is the World Disaster Report, which is made by the International Federation in order basically to map trends in disaster, to assess what is going on. And in this regard, I would be very grateful to Kirsten to provide us a background for the discussion. Before addressing the legal implication, I think it's much more relevant to have a look at what are the current trends with regard to climate change and the impact of disaster and future trends for the affected communities, whose trends could also be unfortunately magnified by the current lack of investment on disaster risk reduction. So, Kirsten, please, you have the floor.
Sure. Thanks a lot, Giulio. And hi, my name is Kirsten Hagen from the IFRC, and hopefully most of you know who we are, but we're an organization that works on behalf of 192 national Red Cross and Red Crescent societies all around the world, focusing on disasters. And one of the areas where we have a real expertise and we support governments is in the area of disaster law. And it's great to be on a panel with Giulio, who is one of the experts in this particular issue. So I wanted to actually show some slides, which I realize is not the norm here, but in particular, in order to show you some of the statistics of what we found. And so the World Disasters Report normally looks at disasters, but this year we focus specifically on climate and weather-related disasters. And we looked back since the 1960s to get some longitudinal trends on what climate and weather-related disasters have happened, who they've impacted, and how. So the map that I think you can see on your screen is a snapshot of some of the disasters that occurred during just the first 6 months of the COVID pandemic. And the reason for showing you this is to really emphasize the fact that disasters don't just happen at once, at one at a time, but they often overlap. And this is where it gets really challenging for communities to handle the impacts. So during the first 6 months of the pandemic, this very short window, we saw well over 100 disasters, and they affected well over 50 million people. Now, 97% of those who were affected by climate and weather-related disasters in particular. And so one of the things that I think people forget in the time of COVID, when they're really focused on the impact of this on our lives, is that climate and weather-related disasters really haven't stopped. And instead, what we're seeing right now is the incredible impact of multiple simultaneous crises. And this is only a sign of what we're going to need to look forward to in the future. So this image here, which I hope everyone can see, is from Western Uganda. And it's actually showing what used to be the children's ward of a hospital. So in Western Uganda, there were heavy rains that caused 4 rivers to burst their banks, and this destroyed homes, a power station, this particular hospital, and displaced thousands of people. Now, floods and landslides at this time affected Uganda, Kenya, and Rwanda, killed some 300 people and displaced 500,000 more. But what's important to be aware is this happened at the same time as COVID and at the same time as a locust invasion was impacting on food security and livelihoods. And so this left nearly 2.6 million people severely food insecure across some 8 countries. Now, if we look back over the last roughly a year that we've been experiencing the COVID pandemic, we have a lot of similar stories from the Americas, from Asia, from Europe. And many of you will remember the heat waves in Europe in summer. Now, these heat waves can have a devastating impact on older people in particular. And so we also see particular communities that are being hit particularly hard. Now, in terms of some of the statistics, in 2019, we saw 308 disasters triggered by natural disasters, and 77% of these were triggered by climate and weather-related disasters. So it wasn't only poorer countries that were affected by these events. This photo is from Australia, where you'll be aware of the bushfires. And in Europe, there were over 3,400 people killed in 3 different heatwave events. I'm hoping that everyone can see this. Yes. So what's interesting about this, and where this is of most importance to us thinking about the future, is not only, and if you look at this graph, the blue line represents climate and weather-related disasters, and the other 2 are different types of disasters. And what you'll see is not only have the number of disasters triggered by extreme weather and climate-related events been increasing systematically since the 60s, and in fact, they've risen almost 35%, but what's interesting is the proportion of disasters attributable to climate and extreme weather events has also increased significantly. So even when we see that the total number of disasters flattened out, the proportion that was attributable to climate and extreme weather events has continued to rise. And so it was 76% of all disasters during the 2000s and up to 83% by the 2010s. Now, one thing to be aware of is the climate and weather-related disasters have claimed more than 410,000 lives in the last 10 years, and they've affected 1.7 billion people around the world in just the last 10 years. And so what we're seeing is that extreme climate and weather-related events are more common, they're more severe, and they're occurring in places where they didn't occur before. So not only do we know that the percentage of events have increased, but we also predict that there will be more in the future. And so unfortunately, we think that tomorrow is going to be worse. It is estimated that 147 million people will be at risk of flooding by 2030. We've already seen an increased intensity of tropical cyclones with more category 4 and 5 storms, and we're expecting significantly more by the end of the 21st century. Right now, nearly 190 million people are occupying land that is below the projected high tide line for 2100. 48% of the global population may be exposed to extreme heat, that's temperatures above 37 degrees, for at least 20 days every year by 2100. And that is presuming that we're actually able to reduce emissions. And if we don't, that's going to be at least double that. But I wanted to finish with one slightly positive note. And this is that overall, the death rates have actually dropped. So we went from 1.75 million people who died due to climate and weather-related disasters in the 1960s, so that entire decade, to less than 0.75 million in the last decade. This is really significant because the numbers of disasters has increased approximately 6 times since the 60s. The world population has at the same time doubled, and yet the numbers of deaths have gone down. And what we're hoping that this means is that our efforts and our investments in disaster risk reduction, in climate adaptation, are really starting to work. But, and this is where we get a little bit worried, the level of investment is not going where it needs to be. So one other issue that the World Disasters Report looked at is we analysed where the funding was going. And what we found was that the average country funding per capita, so per person in a given country, of climate adaptation in the countries with very high risk, so that's the red line, was less than $1 or 1 franc per person. And in the lower vulnerability countries, it was much higher. And so this isn't to say that there shouldn't be money going to the lower vulnerability countries, because every single country is needing investment in climate adaptation right now. But because of the lack of investment in the particularly vulnerable countries, many of these that are fragile and conflict affected, this means that the impacts of climate and weather-related and disasters in the future are not going to be reducing to the level we want, but instead are likely to increase. And so maybe to finish with one particular slide that I like is one that is one of our most fundamental challenges, is actually, can we try and ensure that we're investing where we need and when we need, instead of just where it's easy? And that is particularly important when we're talking about protection issues, because obviously it is the most vulnerable people, the most vulnerable populations, the marginalized communities that are affected the worst, and that have the least support, often from the legal system, from the social protection systems, and so on. So there's just a bit of a context in terms of what we can expect in the future. And I'll hand back to Giulio and some of our expert panelists on the legal implications of this and what needs to be done. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Kirsten. Unfortunately, that really looks like a disaster movie from Hollywood, but that's not, unfortunately, that's the reality, which also have a series of legal implications. We were just mentioning in your last slide, which also have an impact on legal regulation. Just take into account for the climate change regime, the overemphasis on the mitigation phase rather than adaptation, which is also another element to be taken into account for this in this area. With regard to legal issues, the legal implication of such phenomena, we know that the current debate in several fora is about sea level rise, and so we are very proud to have with us Patricia Galbao-Teles, being not only a member of the International Law Commission, but also she's co-chair of the study group on sea level rise in relation to international law, where she is responsible for the subtopic regarding the protection of persons affected by sea level rise. And Patricia is, of course, a scholar at the University of Lisbon and the Singapore Academy of International Law. So with regard to Patricia, my point, of course, everyone is curious about what is going on at the International Law Commission with regard to this seminal topic. And in this regard, I will kind of ask you some insight with regard the current trends in the working group, what we might expect, and also in your position, what could be the relationship with states. We know there will be some states pushing for putting this topic in the agenda of the International Commission, which was quite an unusual approach. But of course, we also know how other states, particularly in debates at the Sixth Committee, might undermine or minimize any result you could achieve. And plus, you were also involved in the activities of the International Law Association, which came out recently with some resolution in this area. And also, in this regard, I would be curious to know a bit more about, in your opinion, what could be the interaction, but also the overlapping and the potential added value of the works of the International Commission with regard to other, let me say, mapping efforts with regard to current obligation in this area.
Thank you so much, Giulio. And let me start by thanking very deeply ASIL for having put this topic on this year's program, in particular to the annual committee, and in that committee to Christy Edwards. And I really appreciate also all the efforts by Ben Javelier and Alisa Yamamoto that have carefully prepared this panel. I'm also very happy to be together in the session today, moderated by Giulio and with such esteemed colleagues and experts in this field. Let me start by saying that what Kirsten has just said really sets the scene nicely and emphasizes the importance of this issue. I mean, if we read the World Disasters Report, if we read the reports from the IPCC, including the latest report on oceans and the cryosphere, we are certainly aware, and I think the science is really showing us that this situation of an increased number of disasters and worsening of disasters, this interface between disasters and climate change, and also, of course, the increasing impacts and adverse impacts of climate change are here. And I think that just also referring to the Grotius lectures that we just have heard from Professor Yves Daudet about never letting a good crisis go to waste, I would say that here, I think the efforts that we have to make in terms of creating a legal framework is to try to avoid this crisis from being worse. I think we still have time. I think everything points to the fact that things will get worse. As Kristen just said, tomorrow will be worse. And the IPCC reports with regard to climate change also tell us that things are getting worse, and they're getting worse at a faster pace than in the past. But rather than waiting for the full crisis to happen, as it seems to be the case with generally international law as a crisis-driven reacting to crisis, and we see with the current COVID pandemic situation how we were not prepared legally, but also in also from a pragmatic point of view. Here, my plea would be, and my position would be, that international law can help in avoiding a bigger crisis to come, and by creating a legal framework, a more robust legal framework to deal with the protection of persons in the event of disasters, and also from adverse impacts of climate change. And with regard to the International Law Commission, where I've been a member since 2017, I think that the International Law Commission, as the body of the United Nations that has the task to promote the progressive development and codification of international law, has been attentive and reactive to these new challenges. There's a slight shift in the agenda in the last years of the Commission from the more traditional topics of international law to topics that are really addressing the current challenges that the international community is facing. And certainly the draft articles that Giulio already mentioned, the draft articles on the protection of persons in the event of the disasters that were finalized in 2016 and are now before the 6th Committee of the General Assembly as a proposal for a convention. They were a good first step in the direction of the international community stepping up the legal framework for dealing with disasters. And currently, the new topic that the Commission has put on the agenda, initially in the long-term program of work in 2018, and then moved it very rapidly to the active agenda in 2019, the topic which is entitled Sea Level Rise in Relation to International Law, is also a clear sign that from the point of view of the International Law Commission, there's certainly an awareness that these issues are extremely important, that international law can help by providing a better legal framework or a more coherent or more clear legal framework for the international community to deal with them. And so this is really the reason why this topic of sea level rise, which is of course only one of the adverse impacts of climate change, but of course an important one since it has the potential to affect all three elements of the state, the territory, people, and government. And so the impact is quite deep in terms of how we see the state and how we conceive the state and its relationship with its government and the population. And this topic made it to, as I was saying, to the agenda of the ILC with compared to how we normally work with the relative rapidness and with a lot of support from UN member states. And this is to address one of the questions that you were raising, Julie, in your initial remarks. This has been a topic that I think the Commission took into account many statements that member states of the UN were making before the 6th Committee, that there was also one state, the Federated States of Micronesia, who made a formal proposal, which is really quite unusual for the topics that the International Law Commission chooses. And the International Law Commission, having this proposal from Micronesia, having since the strong support from member states in the General Assembly, decided to put the topic on the agenda and start working on it quite quickly. And we will focus on three subtopics: law of the sea, statehood, and protection of persons affected by sea level rise. In terms of the outcome, the idea is to do, and that's why a study group was created and not the normal process of a special rapporteur with a proposal for draft articles. We have created the study group because the issue is also so new. It's also pluridisciplinary because it affects so many different areas that our idea in terms of an outcome, at least as a first step, is to have a study mapping the legal issues that sea level rise creates or questions in terms of international law. The last point that you mentioned, and I'll address briefly, and perhaps then we can come back to it, is the relationship with the work of the International Law Association that also has a committee dealing with sea level rise, and of which I'm also a member. They have done, and it's still ongoing, and I'm also very proud to be a member of that committee. They have done impressive work already in terms of law of the sea issues. And at the moment, we are working on statehood and with relation to the protection of persons displaced in the context of sea level rise. There has been a declaration, which is called the Sydney Declaration, that was adopted in 2018, and that contains very important principles to protect persons affected by sea level rise. But I think there's a very good synergy between the work of the ILA, which naturally as a private body works in a different way and not with the close relationship that the ILC has with member states and with the 6th Committee, but the work that has been done so far and will continue to be carried out until 2022 in the ILA, and the work that is now being carried out in the ILC end up by generating a lot of discussion and a lot of synergy. And so this seems to be a very useful exercise. So I would stop my remarks here, and I'll be happy then for the next round of questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Patricia. And of course, also for the general public, don't forget to take advantage of the box chat to make some questions for the final part devoted to a more interactive discussion with our speakers. Of course, it's not just a matter of the climate crisis, the health crisis is not just a matter of legal issues, but it's also call for questioning the role of politicians, of the impact of such events on the affected communities. And in this regard, I'm very glad that ASIL is also hosting His Excellency Mohamed Nasheed, who is the former president of the Maldives, which of course is one of the countries which risk the most from the impact of the sea level rise, and since several years is a real international icon for the action against climate change, and has also played a leading role in advocacy activities in this area. So my question to President Nasheed is basically what is in your perception as how can a national leader can cope with dramatic choices which could be put with regard to the protection of its own population, and also how do you perceive the role of international law in this area? So do you think that international law is supporting your cause, or is just undermining your efforts? You are muted, President. Could you? Yes, please.
I am so sorry. Thank you very much, Professor, and thank you very much, everyone. Good afternoon. It's interesting that I've been listening to everyone speaking, and the points on how do we protect our people, and what role can the international community play in enhancing that. To come to that, I started my life as an activist, and I have been arrested many, many times, tortured twice, but we were able to galvanize our public to political activism. We were able to amend the constitution, have multi-party elections, and in 2008, I was very fortunate to have won those elections. But as I keep saying, it's easy to topple a dictator, but it's not so easy to uproot a dictatorship. 3.5 years into my term, the previous regime came back in a coup and changed our government. Then I went back to prison again. I was in prison again for 2 years. And then I left on exile. I was in England for a while. And we came back. We were fortunate to come back again. We won the elections in 2018. My friend, I was not able to contest because they wouldn't let me contest, but my friend won. But I contested the parliamentary elections, and we won another very handsome majority in the parliament. And I now sit as the speaker. Now, Patricia pointed out a very important point, I thought, that create a legal framework that will avert the crisis and not kind of penalize other people after the crisis. So how do we build a resilient infrastructure, and how do we fund that, and how do we protect our people? I think these are the basic questions that you are asking. On how do we build infrastructure, resilient infrastructure, I have always felt that building not against nature, but alongside and with it is very, very important. So all resilient infrastructure or disaster aversion infrastructure, I feel, should be more biological, should be more soft, and should be more natural. I'll give you an example. In the Maldives, to protect our shoreline, we have rock boulders and reef water breakers. Now, instead of building the water breaker, which costs us $8,000 a meter, and we have 2,000 islands, you can't do it in every island. And, it's just not the Maldives, but the whole of the coastline of South Asia. So it's far better if we still focus on growing a reef instead of trying to build a water breaker that is costing us $8,000 a meter. Now, the World Bank funds these $8,000 a meter water breakers. My suggestion to the World Bank, to the IMF, is to please don't do that. There is now technology, there is now science available that would allow us to build infrastructure that goes alongside nature, but like building a reef, growing a reef, and of course, and implanting a mangrove. Now, what we need more science on it to see how we can enhance the growth and how we can scale up these little reef growing exercises that's happening all over the world. So one thing is, please don't do so much hard infrastructure. Christine, you said that, these people have died. Good, thank you. And we must invest. And you are asking how we are investing the money and who is giving the money and where is the money going. I'm suggesting, do not give us so much money. Please work with us to grow our nature and help that nature to protect us. Let's not try to work against nature. Resilient species of life, like the coral, let's find them and let's scale it up. Let's start growing them instead of pouring concrete all over the place in the name of protection. Bacteria, bugs, for fertilizers and these kind of things. I think it's also very important to have decentralized government for us to be able to protect our people. So then we come to democracy and good governance. I think democracy is the most important adaptation measure. Without it, you will be spending the wrong amount of money at the wrong place, doing the wrong thing. Like, if you, Christian, if you have a look at how much money we have spent for disaster aversion, for infrastructure, we will be shocked, because we've been spending the money on the wrong place, because there is no democracy. And if there is no democracy, you can't make these decisions. You end up doing the wrong thing. So I think that's kind of very, very important. The other things are, a low carbon development strategy with the same kind of economic. Rugia is telling me I've run out of my 5 minutes. The low carbon development strategy that would give you the same economic outcomes, but through less extraction and more recycling and less emission of carbon. And I think the technology is there. We have to come up with legal frameworks in governments as well. So the International Court of Justice, or this kind of being a human rights issue, I would rather it be issues that our own legislations are having to do their own legislation. So we have to come up with climate change framework legislations in our own countries. And if the international community can push governments to do that through whatever kind of judgments that you make in the international fora, I think that would be very, very helpful. Well, thank you so much. And it's lovely listening to you all. There's a lot I would like to say, but we are limited in time.
We can also have a second round. Thanks.
I will stay around.
Yeah. Also to underline, of course, also the functional role of local communities, which is, of course, also one current pillar of system like the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. And we should not forget to think about how much more effective action are if taken and adopted locally based on the local strategies and needs rather than just imposed through international inputs. I'm also glad now to introduce you with Ambassador Duncan Mumuza Laki, who is the legal advisor for Uganda to the UN. He's a senior scholar, also having been vice president of the International Seabed Authority, but he's also a member of the Human Rights Committee. And we know how recently the Human Rights Committee has been at the front page of discussion with regard to the implication of human rights with regard to climate change and disaster, not only with regard to its general comment number 36 on the right to life, where relevant points were raised with regard to the to disaster, but particularly with a series of case law with specific reference to the so-called Toyota case versus New Zealand, which of course relates to climate change with regard to this applicant going to be repatriated to Kiribati, which is just one of the leading case of this new trend in human rights law litigation, which are basically strategic litigation dealing with climate change aspects as currently in front of the European Court of Human Rights and other human rights bodies. In the Toyota case, also Ambassador Lucky also made a very interesting dissenting opinion, because we are all of us familiar with this case, but this case was a failure for the applicant. So also in this regard, I would be very grateful to Ambassador to elaborate a bit about, in your perspective, the role, challenges, as well as opportunities of human rights bodies to advance the agenda of climate change litigation, or what are the current difficulties. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Giulio, for putting me on. And from the onset, I must say I'm honored to be amongst this distinguished group of panelists and other human rights defenders. I see some familiar faces, and I'm in good company. The question of climate change and human rights is taking a lot of due currency right now. Only during this week, I believe it was over the weekend, but it was reported in the week, in Uganda, my home country, the Deputy Chief Justice, while he was addressing new judicial officers, he admonished them to be cognizant of climate-related issues, because most of the resources and the land issues are a result of climate change, no doubt about that. So it is taking currency, and so it behooves us, all kind of fora that are involved, to be able to take this at the back of their mind. But back to the Human Rights Committee, where I'm a member of the Human Rights Committee, but I speak not as such, but I represent my own views here. I don't have the mandate to speak on behalf of the committee. I also don't speak as a legal advisor for the Ugandan mission at the United Nations. I'm speaking out of my own experience, and as a person who would be well served if human rights were observed, even from the climate change perspective. So on the 24th of October 2019, the Human Rights Committee adopted views in the case of Ione Tota against New Zealand, in a case consisting, which you've just described. The author was being ejected from New Zealand back to Kiribati, but he was arguing, and he argued vehemently, that by sending him back to Kiribati, New Zealand would be violating his human rights, his life to life under the covenant, the ICCPR covenant. And in view of General Comment 36, which you alluded to, Giulio, he was, in my view, because I was in the minority, but my view was that, yeah, he was right to claim under that observation. So anyway, New Zealand proceeded to deport him back to Kiribati. But then the conditions in Kiribati are such that due to climate change, it has resulted in the scarcity of habitable space and environmental degradation, and salt water has contaminated fresh water supply. The committee accepted the factual narrative of the complainant, Mr. Teitota, but concluded that the author did not demonstrate clear arbitrariness or error in the domestic authorities' assessment, in this case, New Zealand, as to whether he faced a real or personal and reasonably foreseeable risk of threat to his life as a result of the situation in his home country, Kiribati. Well, I thought this was unfortunate because it is all very clear. Climate change is real. The sea levels have gone up, and indeed, to treat somebody to a situation like that would not sit well with any human rights defender. As they said, the majority of the committee said, okay, if you allow him, you would be opening a floodgate of other immigrants. And therefore, we cannot do that. In my thinking, because I always take myself as the common sense guy on the committee, because it would be like sending somebody back to a sinking ship, because after all, there are many people who are in the ship already, in the sinking vessel. But if the person has already departed and they are trying to save themselves, why would you send them? Because you don't want the other guys, the other occupants of the vessel. So I thought that was unfortunate, and therefore that informed my dissenting decision. Despite not finding in favor of the complainant, the committee's decision is a significant step towards recognition of climate refugees, especially as regards the non-reformer obligations under the human rights law and the ICCPR, which contains the broader protection. The decision affirms that treaty bodies and human rights judicial institutions more broadly can be effective avenues for litigation on climate change issues and environmental matters. I believe if it had gone the other way, if it had gone my way as I had wanted it, it would be a lot easier and the case would be. But in any case, we get a lot of good jurisprudence even from minority decisions. So to that extent, I think we are on the right path, and I hope to see even in my lifetime, in the not too long to go future, when climate change issues are being mainstreamed. So the committee also highlighted the role that international community must play in assisting countries adversely affected by climate change. This is in addition to robust national efforts to curb the effects and progression of climate change. The committee's decision advanced the general debate on the subject of climate refugees and asylum seekers and the related states' human rights obligations with regard to the principle of non-refoulement. And I think this is a good place to begin. If the Human Rights Committee does it, if the other arbitral committees and tribunals do it, I think by and by, climate change, refugees and asylum seekers will begin to be taken more seriously, and their cases would be given due weight as they ought to. Many of the things that we deal with, even on land-based issues, tells me that I have to stop at this and wait to
Thank you,
give any reaction. I thank you.
No, thank you, thanks a lot. So in this first panel, we just have 15 minutes left, but a series of elements were raised. Also, a series of further questions could be made. The first one: what should be the direction for international law in this area? So, do you need should we need more binding rules in this area, or just more legal coherence? We know states are facing also multiple inputs coming from different regimes, from climate change law, from human rights law, from the Sendai framework, the SDGs, and of course, I think they also get lost because sometimes they're just developed in siloed approaches, and it's very hard to have a cross-fertilization among such areas of law and instruments. Another point also raised just at the end by my ambassador is also the question whether legal action in this area could be a solution, or it could conversely just result in sometimes oratory action which might fail due to procedural or substantive shortcomings, with the final end to frustrate the affected communities, but also to undermine potential diplomatic and legal efforts, because states will be put in a sort of defensive position, risking a continuing series of legal suits against them. And finally, the point of the global south, how it could be put in the international agenda. Last week, all of us were bombarded by the disaster occurring in Australia, but unfortunately, on the same period, a much more severe disaster occurred in Thailand and Indonesia, with more than 400,000 people affected by floods, and no one knew anything about them. And so, also in this case, it's possible for the global south to get the principle of cooperation and solidarity, which were also evoked by Daudet in his Grotius lecture before, put in the reality. So I just leave to the speaker this question that you can pick up in a short with short answer potential any of these points. Kirsten.
Sure. I mean, I think we have so many international law experts that I'm a little hesitant to dive into what is needed from international law. But one point that I think is worth making, as you were asking about, do we need more laws? One of the things we see working at the national level is that there is a significant amount of international agreement out there that is not yet being translated at the national level and that is not integrated well at the national level. And it's worth pointing out that that is a really important starting point, is to have the laws in place that are addressing human rights issues, that are addressing what's in Sendai, that are addressing what's in Paris, that are addressing what's in the SDGs in a coherent approach. And at the moment, what we're seeing is very siloed legal regimes at the national level, often missing out key elements. But the elements that are needed, that are there in international law, a lot of them are already there. So maybe just to I mean, it's probably obvious for a lot of people, but I wouldn't forget that we have a lot that's actually really good, and there is a question of how we implement that at the national level and how we reflect that in national laws, and whether they're coherent, whether they're up to date, whether they're actually ready for the types of risks that we're now seeing.
Patricia.
Thank you, Julia. Yes, on the same point, I will refrain from commenting on the issue of legal action and global south, although it's hard. But just the point where, I mean, the question of how to approach this from an international law making perspective, I think there's one important point, is that there's certainly treaty fatigue, and there's not a lot of appetite for new treaties. I think we see that from the draft articles on protection of persons in the event of disasters. And in reality, all that the ILC has done in the past 20 years, that stays in the 6th committee and doesn't move from there. So what we propose to do in the Sea Level Rise Study Group is not a proposal for a new treaty. It's indeed a mapping exercise, a stock-taking exercise to identify what is already out there in terms of legal principles, legal norms, including on the topic of protection of persons affected by sea level rise, try to put them in a holistic manner, so that it can facilitate the role of states, international organizations, all the stakeholders. And I think the point that President Nasheed made and that Christian just picked up now, I think the question of having also, not only at the international level, but also at the national level, good legislation, good practices. And I think what we really need now is to try to combine this in a more readable and understandable framework to make it more efficient on the ground. And I would stop here for time reasons.
President Nasheed, what are your opinions in this regard? You are muted.
Muted.
Thank you. Again, I would like to say that, I would be looking at an international treaty or a convention that has an impact on local conditions. How can we make local legislations dependent on international conventions? And we can do that. So for me, whatever international convention or a judgment that you make, it must have an impact on the ground. So it must force our legislators and our leadership, our rulers, to have a legislative framework, again, that would build resilience, that would allow us to conserve things, that would allow us to have a more sustainable development strategy. We must have local legislations, and the international legislations or judgments must force us to do that. I think that's the point that I would like. The International Court of Justice did make a judgment on me, and the hope would be that similar actions, similar things would not happen again. So whatever conviction, whatever rulings that comes out, I hope that it would be translated and it would have an impact at home. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. Ambassador, what are your opinion?
My opinion is that, I see, for example, the IOC should be a good place to begin. Because when we go to the 6th committee and indeed the General Assembly, there are so many, you have 193 opinions to deal with. But in the IOC, I think Patricia will bear us out here. It is a good place to begin. Under their mandate to formulate new topics, this is an area that could be mainstreamed. And it would be augmented by the international judicial tribunals. And it is hoped that it would achieve, eventually it would, this practice would gain sufficient notoriety, too much to be ignored. And eventually, just like I've quoted in the case of Uganda, where the Deputy Chief Justice said, you guys, as you take on this new assignment of judicial work, bear in mind this new area. And if it can happen in Uganda, it should happen it should have a ripple effect by and by, so that we see it coming. But the treaties, you can only, the ICCPR itself, we have 170 odd member states, others are not. So how are you going to enforce it? But we need universality, and this universality can be achieved, I think, through the practices of the IRC and the other tribunals that are there, So that's how I look at it for the moment.
Thank you. We still have 5 minutes left. In case there are some questions from the audience, don't hesitate to make them now, but of course also take into account how you are going to have the continued conversation option available for an informal discussion. I will also make you a final question, which is the opposite way around. We are discussing quite a lot about human rights, the protection, and so far and so on. But maybe another point would be that there are too many, let me say, too much prominent. The role of human rights is more rhetoric than effective, and this might also have an impact on states, which are bombarded by multiple inputs by different human rights bodies that can hardly keep keep with the agenda of the human rights community so far. So do you think that we are requesting too much to states? Do you think that we should leave them with more discretion on how to act, or that's just a sort of good excuse for states for not taking any action? Or also, let me say, what might be the impact of COVID in this discussion, because this must also, let me say, diverge a lot of attention by the international community, leaving such topic again in a corner in the discussion. So it is a bit more provocative. Anyone would like to take it? Still have 3 minutes.
Well, Professor, my view is that we have too less international frameworks that brings countries together. For instance, the fish doesn't know that there are borders. The air is all connected. Carbon particles travel all the way from China to the Maldives. And so we need more international conventions, and we need more international work together. This is not the time for isolation. But at the same time, I keep pointing out that we need a lot of decentralization. So singular frameworks, international frameworks that tells countries to do certain types of things. But those things, again, must be decent in a decentralized manner. My view is more international work.
To augment what His Excellency the President is saying, I think I would not go for a treaty or convention, because then you would have to kind of first and foremost to get states to sign on to those conventions. And it is not an easy thing, the ratifications that are needed. But as we continue with the practice, with the instruments that we have already, I think are sufficient, or are good enough, not quite sufficient, I should say, but they are good enough to begin us on a practice that would lead us there. But to begin with a treaty, you saw only too recently when a southern country, which will remain unnamed, withdrew from an important treaty regarding climate, only to be gotten back into. So that's a treaty and conventions may not be the way to go, but practice and the practice. I mean, there are so many things that we deal with, like on the law of the sea, unwritten, something like, you cannot just leave somebody drowning or capsizing. You are, and this is one other area that the Human Rights Committee dealt with when I believe it was an Italian ship which didn't, give help to a capsizing vessel, and it was held. And that was based on customary international law, not written. Some aspects of the international, of the law of the sea convention, but there was a heavy reliance on customer international law. So I believe that this is the way to go. Thank you.
Okay, so I think we have handed our time. I would like to congratulate all the speakers for this very interesting perspective on this relevant topic, and I really invite everyone to join us in the continue the conversation. We also could address one point which was raised just at the last moment in the chat, dealing about what can students can do in this area, how the youth can act,
Professor,
which I think is a relevant point.
I have to go. I am.
Okay, don't worry, President. So the final note that we are going in the continued conversation room will be also what about the role of the youth in this area, and I think that's something we should care about it, which are already also a legal implication we have seen in the complaint in the Committee for the Rights for the Child, or in the complaint in front of the European Court of Human Rights, where the future generation perspective should be put in the place also from the legal point of view. But we'll continue the conversation in the different rooms. So thanks a lot. Thank Esil for convening this session. Thank you a lot. Bye.
Thanks a lot.